Hi, class. We left school before spring break, and we had been reading Little House on the Prairie because we do a lot of pioneer things at this time of year, and I am hoping that we get to have our pioneer day when we get back to school. But since it's up in the air, I didn't want to just half read Little House on the Prairie. So, for those of you that are interested, I am going to read a few minutes every day of Little House on the Prairie because it really tells you all through literature what life was like on the prairie. And I think a good story is such a wonderful way to learn about something that I want to finish this for those of you that are really excited about it. And I would love to read to you every day. So, how we left it before spring break was Pa and Mary and Laura found the deserted Indian camp where the Indians, remember they called them Indians in those days and not Native Americans, where the Indians had broke their camp, and they were looking around and they saw where the holes had been for their poles, for their teepees, and then they found some Indian beads and brought him home. And it ends with Laura giving some to, actually, I think it was Mary, gave some to her little sister. And it was really hard to share those beautiful beads that they found, but they did. So now we are at a new chapter, and it's called Fever and Ague. And an ague is like a chill. It's actually another word for fever. So it's like body chills and not feeling really well. And the picture on the cover of this chapter is of Mary and Laura, and it looks like they're picking berries. And I would say you have to be careful when you're out on the plains and you're just picking berries, right? Make sure you would ask your parents, which I'm sure they did, because we do not know what is safe and what is not. Okay. Now, blackberries were ripe, and in the hot afternoons, Laura went with Ma to pick them. The big, black, juicy berries hung thick in briar patches in the creek bottoms. Some were in the shade of trees and some were in the sun. But the sun was so hot that Laura and Ma stayed in the shade. There were plenty of berries. Deer lay in the shady groves and watched Ma and Laura. Blue jays flew at their sunbonnets and scolded because they were taking the berries. Snakes hurriedly crawled away from them, and in the trees the squirrels woke up and chattered at them. Wherever they went among the scratchy briars, mosquitoes rose up in buzzing swarms. Mosquitoes were thick on the big ripe berries, sucking the sweet juice. But they liked to bite Laura and Ma as much as they liked to eat blackberries. Laura's finger and her mouth were purple-black with berry juice. Her face and her hands and her bare feet were covered with briar scratches and mosquito bites, and they were spattered with purple stains too, where she had slapped at the mosquitoes. But every day they brought home pails full of berries, and Ma spread them in the sun to dry. Every day they ate all the blackberries they wanted, and the next winter they would have dried blackberries to stew. Mary hardly ever went to pick blackberries. She stayed in the house to mind baby Carrie because she was older. In the daytime, there were only one or two mosquitoes in the house, but at night, if the wind wasn't blowing hard, mosquitoes came in thick swarms. On still nights, Pa kept piles of damp grass burning all around the house and the stable. The damp grass made a smudge of smoke to keep the mosquitoes away, but a good many mosquitoes came anyway. Pa could not play his fiddle in the evenings because there were so many mosquitoes. Mr. Edwards did not come visiting after supper anymore because the mosquitoes were so thick in the bottoms. All night, Pet and Patty and the colt and the calf and the cows were stamping and swishing their tails in the stable. And in the morning, Laura's forehead was speckled with mosquito bites. This won't last long, Pa said. Fall's not far away, and the first cold wind will settle them. Laura did not feel very well. On the day she felt cold, even in the hot sunshine, and she could not get warm by the fire. Ma asked why she and Mary did not go out to play, and Laura said she didn't feel like playing. She was tired and she ached. Ma stopped her work and asked, "Where do you ache?" Laura didn't know exactly. She just said, "I just ache. My legs ache." "I ache too," Mary said. Ma looked at them and said they looked healthy, but she said something must be wrong or they wouldn't be so quiet. She pulled up Laura's skirt and petticoats to see where her legs ached, and suddenly Laura shivered all over. She shivered so that her teeth rattled in her mouth. Ma put her hand against Laura's cheek. "You can't be cold," she said. "Your face is hot as fire." Laura felt like crying, but of course she didn't. Only little babies cried. I'm hot now, she said, and my back aches. Ma called Pa, and he came in. Charles, do look at the girls, she said. I do believe they are sick. Well, I don't feel any too well myself, said Pa. First I'm hot and then I'm cold. I ache all over. Is that the way you feel, girls? Do your very bones ache? Mary and Laura said that was the way they felt. Then Ma and Pa looked a long time at each other, and Ma said, the place for you girls is in bed. It was so queer to be put to bed in the daytime, and Laura was so hot that everything seemed wavering. She held onto Ma's neck while Ma was undressing her, and she begged Ma to tell her what was wrong with her. You will be all right, don't worry, Ma said cheerfully. Laura crawled into bed and Ma tucked her in. It felt good to be in bed. Ma smoothed her forehead with her cool, soft hand and said, there now, go to sleep. Laura did not exactly go to sleep, but she didn't really wake up again for a long, long time. Strange things seemed to keep happening in a haze. She would see Pa crouching by the fire in the middle of the night, and then suddenly sunshine hurt her eyes, and Ma fed her broth from a spoon. Something dwindled slowly, smaller and smaller, till it was tinier than the tiniest thing. Then it slowly swelled till it was larger than anything could be. Two voices jabbered faster and faster. Then a slow voice drawled more slowly than Laura could bear. There were no words, only voices. Mary was hot in bed beside her. Mary threw off the covers, and Laura cried because she was so cold. But then she was burning up, and Pa's hand shook the cup of water. Water spilled down her neck. The tin cup rattled against her teeth till she could hardly drink. Then Ma tucked in the covers, and Ma's hand burned against Laura's cheek. She heard Pa say, go to bed, Caroline, and Ma said, you're sicker than I am, Charles. Laura opened her eyes and saw bright sunshine. Mary was sobbing. I want a drink of water. I want a drink of water. Jack went back and forth between the big bed and the little bed. Laura saw Pa lying on the floor by the big bed. Jack pawed at Pa and whined. He took hold of Pa's sleeve with his teeth and shook it. Pa's head lifted up a little, and he said, I must get up. I must. Caroline and the girls. Then his head fell back, and he lay still. Jack lifted his nose and howled. Laura tried to get up, but she was too tired. Then she saw Ma's red face looking over the edge of the bed. Mary was all the time crying for water. Ma looked at Mary, and then she looked at Laura. Laura, can you do it? Yes, Ma, Laura said. This time she got out of bed, but when she tried to stand up, the floor rocked and she fell down. Jack's tongue lapped and lapped at her face, and he quivered and whined, but he stood still and firm when she took hold of him and sat up against him. She knew she must get water to stop Mary's crying, and she did. She crawled all the way across the floor to the water bucket. There was only a little of water in it. She shook so with cold, and she could hardly get a hold of the dipper, but she did get a hold of it. She dipped up some water, and she set out to cross the enormous floor again. Jack stayed beside her all the way. Mary's eyes didn't open. Her hands held onto the dipper, and her mouth swallowed all the water out of it. Then she stopped crying. The dipper fell on the floor, and Laura crawled under the covers, and it was a long time before she began to get warm again. Sometimes she heard Jack sobbing. Sometimes he howled, and she thought he was a wolf, but she was not afraid. She lay burning up and hearing him howl. She heard voices jabbering again and the slow voice drawling, and she opened her eyes and saw a big black face close above her. It was coal black and shiny. Its eyes were black and soft. Its teeth shone white in a thick, big mouth. This face smiled, and a deep voice said softly, drink this, little girl. And here's the picture of her trying to get the water, with Jack helping her. She doesn't look so good, does she? An arm lifted under her shoulders, and a black hand held up a cup to her mouth. Laura swallowed a bitter swallow and tried to turn her head, but the cup followed her mouth. The mellow, deep voice said again, drink it, it will make you well. So Laura swallowed the whole bitter dose. When she woke up, a fat woman was stirring the fire. Laura looked at her carefully, and she was not black. She was tanned like Ma. I want a drink of water, please, Laura said. The fat woman brought it at once. The good cold water made Laura feel better. She looked at Mary asleep beside her. She looked at Pa and Ma asleep in the big bed. Jack lay half asleep on the floor. Laura looked again at the woman and asked, "Who are you?" "I'm Mrs. Scott," the woman said, smiling. "There, now you feel better, don't you?" "Yes, thank you," Laura said politely, and the fat woman brought her a cup of hot prairie chicken broth. "Drink it all up like a good child," she said, and Laura drank every drop of the broth. "Now go to sleep," said Mrs. Scott. "I'm here to take care of everything till you are well." The next morning, Laura felt so much better that she wanted to get up, but Mrs. Scott said she must stay in bed until the doctor came. She lay and watched Mrs. Scott tidy the house and give medicine to Pa and Ma and Mary. Then it was Laura's turn. She opened her mouth and Mrs. Scott poured a dreadful bitterness out of a small folded paper onto Laura's tongue. Laura drank water and swallowed and drank again. She could swallow the powder, but she couldn't swallow the bitterness. Then the doctor came, and he was the black man. Laura had never seen a black man before, and she could not take her eyes off Dr. Tan. He was so very black. She would have been afraid of him if she had not liked him so much. He smiled at her with all his white teeth. He talked with Pa and Ma and laughed a rolling, jolly laugh. They all wanted him to stay longer, but he had to hurry away. Mrs. Scott said all the settlers up and down the creek had the fever and the ague. There were not enough well people to take care of the sick, and she had been going from house to house, working night and day. "It's a wonder you ever lived through," she said, "all of you down at once. What might have happened if Dr. Tan hadn't found them, she didn't know." Dr. Tan was a doctor with the Indians. He was on his way north to Independence when he came to Pa's house. It was a strange thing that Jack, who hated strangers and never let one come near the house until Ma or Pa told him he had gone to greet Dr. Tan and begged him to come in. Jack had helped save them. "And here you all were, more dead than alive," Mrs. Scott said. "Dr. Tan had stayed with them a day and a night before Mrs. Scott came. Now he was doctoring all the sick settlers. Mrs. Scott said that all this sickness came from eating watermelons. She said, I've said 100 times if I have once that watermelons." "What's that?" Pa exclaimed. "Who's got watermelons?" Mrs. Scott said that one of the settlers had planted watermelons in the creek bottoms, and every soul who had eaten one of those melons was down sick that very minute. She said she had warned them, but no, there was no arguing with them. They would eat those melons, and now they were paying for it. "I haven't tasted a good slice of watermelon since Hector was a pup," said Pa. The next day he was out of bed. The next day Laura was up. Then Ma got up, and then Mary. They were all thin and shaking, but they could take care of themselves, so Mrs. Scott went home. Ma said she didn't know how they could ever thank her, and Mrs. Scott said, "Pshaw, what are neighbors for? But to help each other out." Pa's cheeks were hollows, and he walked slowly. Ma often had to sit down to rest. Laura and Mary didn't feel like playing. Every morning they all took the bitter powder, but Ma still smiled her lovely smile, and Pa whistled cheerfully. "It's an ill wind that doesn't blow some good," he said. He wasn't able to work, so he could make a rocking chair for Ma. So as he was staying inside, he was working on a rocking chair for her. He brought some slender willows from the creek bottoms, and he made the chair in the house. He could stop any time to put wood on the fire to lift a kettle for Ma. First, he made 4 stout legs and braced them firmly with cross pieces, and then he cut thin strips of the tough willow skin just under the bark. He wove the strips back and forth. He split a long, straight sapling down the middle and pegged one half of it to each side of the seat. He braced a big, high curved piece to make the back of the chair, and then he wove the thin willow strips across, up, and down and under until they filled the chair. This is what the chair looks like that he was making. Last of all, he split a large willow which had grown into a curve. He turned the chair upside down, and he pegged the curved pieces to its leg to make the rockers, and the chair was done. And I'm going to stop there. We're still in the middle of that chapter. But Pa disagreed with Mrs. Scott that it was the watermelons. Think back to what they were all doing before that. There was a bunch of mosquitoes in the air. So we'll have to keep reading and see if they ever talk about what may have caused them to all be sick at once. Anyways, hope you're having a great day, kids. Bye.